counsel is saying Mr. Hall made statements against his interest, but those are not the statements he's trying to have Mr. Hall testify about. The statements he wants Mr. Hall to testify about, that he has asked the court to allow, despite the invocation of the Fifth Amendment, are not the statements against interest. To step back just a minute, counsel argues that he has a constitutional right to present a defense. That's true, but there are tons of cases that recognize that's true, but defendants still have to follow the rules of evidence. The rules of evidence, hearsay rules, have to be satisfied for the statements that counsel wants to come in through Mr. Hall, despite a Fifth Amendment invocation, are covered. And the statement against interest, counsel relies on all the statements that he doesn't intend to introduce. And for purposes of the sort of catch-all exception, well, incidentally, before I get there, the statement against interest in criminal cases also has some indication of trustworthiness before they can be admitted in a criminal case.
Well, isn't that taken care of by the court finding that it is so far contrary to the person's penal interest? That's the reliability part. Otherwise, we would have needed the second part of the rule, which says that if it's an inculpatory statement but exculpates another, you have to have corroboration. That same corroboration requirement does not seem to apply to the person. And I say that to just note that it's almost saying it has to be or it is we consider reliable because it is so clearly and far contrary to a person's penal interest.
Statement against interest has an additional requirement in criminal cases, and that is some indication for the entire statement. So it's similar to the analysis under the sort of catch-all exception. And, there's a lot about Mr. Hall's statement that is self-serving and unreliable.
For example.
I'm sorry?
For example.
For example, he denies the pills to Mr. Floyd, denies that he had pills. We know a lot of that's not. There's a lot of evidence that suggests that's not true. He gave false information at the scene at least twice. He did flee from Minnesota and had to be apprehended in Texas. He gave very sketchy details about his own involvement, denied having any fake money, passing any fake money. So there are a lot of reasons to doubt Mr. Hall's credibility when analyzing the interrogating the state. Very self-serving.
And what are your thoughts regarding the body of evidence that you consider that you could legitimately take a Fifth Amendment claim of compelled self-incrimination versus is it smaller, larger, or as counsel says, the same group of factors that fall under 804b3 statement against penal interest?
Well, that's the primary point I was trying to make. The evidence that counsel thinks can come in despite the invocation of the Fifth Amendment, none of that is a statement against interest. It's a description he had of others, of Mr. Floyd. That's not implicating himself and thereby not creating a statement against interest or something that would implicate him beyond the obvious fact that he is present. He's present in a vehicle where drugs are present. There are indications that he may not have been truthful when he said he didn't give Mr. Floyd any pills and may not have been aware of it. And there are those questions. He will have to be asked if he was under the influence of any controlled substances that day because it fundamentally affects his ability to know, remember, and relate. And that, I think, we will have then essentially an indication just on that question alone. But that sphere of evidence counsel wants to put in does not constitute a statement against interest. Other statements he made, which I think even the court realizes he would have the right to Fifth Amendment, or what counsel is claiming are these statements against interest. the statements he was in don't fit under that exception. They're just plain hearsay. And that's the fundamental problem that we have with trying to limit the sphere of information to come out of Mr. Floyd, or to come out of Mr. Hall, excuse me, that it's
What I'm going to do is I'm going to take this under advisement of the super case and consider counsel's arguments, and I'll give you a ruling at 1 o'clock before we bring the jury back. Yes, please.
It's at 781 Northwest 2D 390 of Minnesota Court of Appeals 2010.
I'll take a look at that and we'll consider counsel's arguments and we'll come back at.
The purpose is just for clarification is, in terms of the questions that I provided to the court, you would, as I understood the court's instructions, we're limiting those questions to just in the car.
Correct.
Time frame in the car. That's the basis. The statement that Agent Henning took, and I would intend to potentially play, would be more of the description because of what they did that day.
Right. Understood. Okay. Any other motions we have to deal with this morning? Otherwise, we should start on the jury.
Discussion we had in chambers relevant to last night's event.
You have a motion? Let's do it.
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, I am requesting, again, sequestration of the jury in view of the incidents of last night. As the court, I'm sure, is aware, an officer-involved shooting took place in the city of Brooklyn Center, Minnesota. As a result of that, there was some fairly extensive civil unrest that occurred. I would note for the court that we have at least one juror who's a resident of that particular city, and other jurors who have connections to Brooklyn Center. Given that this is obviously a high-profile case, this is a case that evokes a lot of emotion for a lot of people. Ultimately, Your Honor, the question becomes: will the jury be competent to make a decision, regardless of the potential outcome of their decision? There's two possible verdicts:
everybody
guilty or guilty. My concern is that these jurors, it's an ongoing concern that the juror in Hennepin County being exposed extensively to the media before coming in and serving as a juror.
Second channel.
At least initially cautioned to avoid news about this particular incident.
Second channel.
We questioned one juror already about whether she had seen some particular pieces of information that had not been presented to court. She had credible responses to the court, but ultimately this incident, while it is, I understand it's not this case. I understand that it is not involved, that it does not involve these same parties. But the problem is that the emotional response that case creates sets the stage for a jury to say, I'm not going to vote not guilty because I'm concerned about the outcome. During voir dire, we have many jurors who, on both sides of the political or social debate, who expressed concern about if they don't agree, if the public doesn't agree with the verdict. This incident last night highlights, and I think brings it to the forefront of the jury's mindset that a verdict in this case is going to have consequences. And they've been exposed to that already. So at this point, I would request that the court further voir dire, first and foremost, further voir dire jurors as to whether or not they have learned of this, because some jurors may be completely avoiding the media and some may not. So we should, I believe, first voir dire jurors to see what, if anything, they have learned about last night's events. Second, whether those events would have any impact on their decision-making process, or concerns about their decision-making process. I think that the jury should be sequestered. I think that the jury should have been sequestered. I made that clear. And
everybody know I got another
discussions and motion. I think the jury should have been sequestered throughout the pendency of this trial. And I think that the jury needs to be cautioned at the beginning of every day and at the end of every day to avoid all media. Again, we've had discussions about that in chambers. So I believe, Your Honor, that that at a bare minimum, that's what should happen.
Does the state have a position?
Yes, Your Honor, thank you. The state opposes the motion for sequestration. I don't believe that sequestration would be appropriate or frankly effective in this matter. It's a different case. It's a different department. It is an officer-involved shooting. It is something that happened nearby. We don't know what the facts of the case are at this particular point as those things are unfolding. But world events happen. Things continue to happen in the state, despite the fact that we're all here at trial. That's just what happens. And we can't have every single world event that might affect somebody's attitude or emotional state or anything be the grounds to come back and re-voir dire all the jurors. The court, in our voir classes, we asked the jurors, specifically the issue that Mr. Nelson is concerned about, whether they would be so concerned about the outcome of a verdict that they would be unable to be fair and impartial, render either a guilty or not verdict. And all of the jurors who were sworn in the panel said that they would be able to do that. And the court will further instruct them that they are to do that. They're to render their verdict without result. And the law presumes that jurors follow the court's instructions, and we should presume that they meant what they said when they said that they can set aside these external issues and decide the case based solely on the evidence. So I think it would be inappropriate to voir dire jurors now about events that, while related and being on the same topic of the case, involve this case. In terms of sequestration, I don't think that would be an effective remedy. Again, as far as the court admonishing the jurors to avoid all media, I don't oppose that request. I think that it does present some issues. If you order the jurors to avoid all media, then it's very difficult to avoid all media. And we'd have to tightly define what does avoid all media mean. Years ago it used to mean don't read the newspaper, don't watch TV. It means something different now, I suppose. Media comes at us in all different forms. I think it'd be very difficult to follow an order to avoid all media. And while it might have the effect of reducing the media contact, I would have a situation where that if a juror inadvertently receives some media on some unrelated thing, that would be a grounds of claiming juror misconduct because they didn't follow what would be a nearly impossible court order. So I think the court could fashion some guidance as to what to do. You could encourage them to avoid all media. You could even order them to do it, but if something inadvertently filters through, I think we can't overreact. I think we have to look at that as an individual basis, just like you did with the other juror question that we had the other day and found out that it really wasn't what we thought it could have been.
I'm going to deny the motion to sequester the jury and for additional voir dire. This is a totally different case. And I realize there's civil unrest, and maybe some of the jurors did hear about that. The reason why in my initial order I said we're not going to sequester, but we might go to it in the middle of trial if the concern there was that despite keeping jurors anonymous, that somebody may find out who one of the jurors is and reach out and have an inappropriate attempt to tamper with the jury. There's no indication that that's happened in this case, and that was the concern about going to sequestration. I understand the argument from the defense that this now puts them even more ill at ease, but I think sequestering them will only aggravate that. Oh, I heard about the civil unrest, and now the judge is putting us into sequestration. There must be a greater threat to our security. I think the better way is to just continue with the trial as we've been going, and that's a separate issue. They should treat it as such. It'd be a difference if it was civil unrest following another verdict. So the jury can see what the consequence of a certain verdict might be in a similar case, but that's not this case. The jurors all are aware and we're concerned about their safety because of what happened in May of 2020. The civil unrest that followed there. Not a big surprise that there's now civil unrest in response to this case, but I don't think that should heighten the jurors' concern. I think it's probably the same as it was before. They all have a concern that they expressed and were very honest about. And so I'm not going to sequester them. We'll sequester them on Monday when we anticipate doing closing. So I will proceed accordingly. So with that, let's bring in the jury.
Great. Really,
Good morning. I'm Bisiona Leary. Thank you for joining us for our continuing coverage of the Derek Chauvin trial today, marking day 11 of testimony. I want to bring in Mary Moriarty, a former Hennepin County Chief Public Defender who is joining us as our legal analyst for today. First of all, thank you very much, Mary, for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, the court addressing several motions this morning, one of them, the defense requesting that the jury be sequestered following the civil unrest Sunday after police in Brooklyn Center kill a black man. The judge, are you surprised?
No, I'm not. And in fact, he felt that in an earlier order when he said it was possible that he might sequester the jury during the trial, what he was concerned about was somebody trying to tamper with the jurors. And that's not the situation here. So I'm not at all surprised he denied that motion.
And I thought one of the other big takeaways from the motions this morning is the development that Maurice Hall, who was a passenger in George Floyd's vehicle that night, will be called to the stand tomorrow. And from the sounds of it, it could really get complicated.
It's a very complicated legal issue. And I think what the judge is going to do is call him outside the presence of the jury and have the lawyers ask him questions. It's a complicated issue of whether the statements Hall made help him or hurt him, would help him or hurt him in a future criminal proceeding against him. And so that's what was being argued. The law says that if you make a statement against your interest that could be used against you, it is deemed to be more trustworthy and reliable. But if you make a statement that's self-serving or helps you, that it's not particularly trustworthy. So that's really what the argument was about this morning. The judge is taking it under advisement and will tell the lawyers and answer some of those questions this afternoon.
And also this morning, the defense seeking to exclude an expert witness that's going to be called up by the state today. And the judge, it seemed, meeting the defense halfway, saying that this expert, they can only say, testify on certain topics and not others.
Yes, he wanted to know what this expert had to add that was different than all of the other experts. He mentioned last week that the testimony on use of force was getting cumulative, which simply means we're hearing the same thing over and over. So he questioned the state about why they needed an additional expert. The state's response was that this particular expert approaches use of force from an academic perspective, and that he would be talking about national standards. That may be about if Chauvin had gone to some kind of warrior training or something that wasn't offered by MPD, but was MPD officers were participating in. That may be what this expert is getting at. Ultimately, even though Judge Cahill did not seem to be happy about it, and he did limit some of the testimony that the expert will be able to give about the crowd, he did seem to allow most of the testimony, which the state said would be about 90 minutes this morning.
Yeah, it should be really interesting. And as the court enters its third week of testimony, what are you expecting? At some point, the state will rest its case.
Yes, and the judge this morning, he said have to look at the instructions in this case. The instructions are what the jury tells the judge they have to apply about the law in this case. And those instructions are being hotly contested right now. And so I imagine that we'll be addressing that on Friday. Usually judges don't want to send juries out on Friday afternoon. This is a long trial. It's emotional. He wants to give the lawyer an opportunity to prepare for their closing. So everybody will be able to have the weekend to prepare, to rest, to get ready to go for the jurors to get this case on Monday.
Mary, can you explain how, we've heard from several witnesses that were called to the stand by the state. Now it will change, I'd assume, that things will shift a little bit once the defense starts calling witnesses and expert witnesses to the stand.
Yes. We know one of the witnesses that they are going to call is Dr. David Fowler, who's a medical examiner, used to be a medical examiner in Maryland. Now he's retired and does consulting. We know that he is going to attribute the cause of death of George Floyd to drug use, the weak heart, and adrenaline during the struggle. So remember that the state will have an opportunity to cross-examine those witnesses. So we've known that cause of death was extremely important. Remember that the instruction that the jury is likely to get is that to convict Derek Chauvin, the jury has to find beyond a reasonable doubt that Derek Chauvin's actions and the actions of the other officers were a substantial cause of death. And what role the heart, the drugs, that sort of thing played is actually a point of contention in the instructions. But in general, simply because you have a bad heart or you're on drugs, if his actions set in motion events that led to your death, that would make you guilty under Minnesota law.
And as a refresher, can you again explain the objective of the prosecution and the objective of the defense in this trial?
Sure. The state's theory all along has been that Derek Chauvin and the other former officers used force that they should not have used against George Floyd. And what they did was put him in a prone position, meaning on his stomach, on the ground, with his hands behind his back, and they applied pressure on top of him. As you heard the expert, Dr. Chauvin, testify last week, that pressure on Mr. Floyd made him kind of pancaked or squished against the asphalt, which led him not to be able to breathe. And so the state's theory here is that those actions by the officers were the cause of George Floyd's death. They had an expert that said a person without a bad heart or drugs would have died anyway, but they don't have to prove that. They just have to prove that that Chauvin and the other former officers' actions were a substantial cause of death. In terms of the defense, they have argued, and it sounded though this morning that if you have a witness, a use of force expert, who is going to say that the crowd, the bystanders, that we have somehow distracted Derek Chauvin from his job. So that we'll apparently be hearing from a use of force expert. But the big contested issue here is what actually led to George Floyd's death. As I said, the defense is going to call an expert or experts about that.
Mary, I'm sorry to interrupt. Court is back in session. Look forward to chatting with you soon. Day 11 of testimony.
Good morning, Your Honor.
We'll see how this plays out.
Raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony about to give will be the truth and nothing but the truth? I affirm. And Doctor, if you wouldn't mind, we'd appreciate it if you take your mask off. And so let's test it out by having you give us your full name, spelling each of your names.
My name is Jonathan Rich, Jonathan Rich.
Mr. Blackwell.
Thank you, Your Honor.
What's all the spelling?
Sure.
Man, what happened to the oil?
AirPods? Thank you. This Blackwell.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Rich, you're a medical doctor. You have to answer yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Would you tell us where you're currently employed?
Sure. I am a cardiologist at Northwestern Memorial Hospital in Chicago, Illinois, where I also am an associate professor of medicine at Northwestern University.
Dr. Rich, what have you come to talk to the jury about today?
I'm here as an expert cardiology specialist to provide my opinion as to how Mr. George Floyd died.
Have you ever testified in a court of law before?
This is my first time.
Would you briefly summarize for us your educational background?
Sure. So I attended the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. My undergraduate studies where I majored in biology and performed my pre-medical coursework.
Where did you go to medical school?
I went to the Albert Einstein College of Medicine in New York.
You know what a residency is?
Yes, I do know what a residency is.
Would you tell the gentleman of the jury what a residency is?
Sure. So after completing medical school, I went on to do training in internal medicine, and that training is referred to as a residency. I believe the term originated because you seem to spend all your time in the hospital. You were basically a resident. And so that was a 3-year internal medicine residency.
And where did you do that residency?
I did that at the Brigham and Women's Hospital at Harvard Medical School.
Did you also have something called a fellowship?
Yes, I did.
What is a fellowship?
So upon completing internal medicine residency training, many will go on to practice at that point. I opted to specialize in cardiology. And so when you take on an additional specialty, that form of training is referred to as a fellowship.
And so did you do a fellowship?
Yes.
And where did you do your fellowship?
So I did my fellowship at the University of Chicago.
And were you what's known as a chief fellow?
Yes, I was the chief fellow.
What is a chief fellow?
So every fellowship program has about, on average, 18 cardiology fellows, 6 in each class. And so I was bestowed the honor of chief fellow, which is basically being the captain of the group.
Did you have any additional training then after your fellowship?
Yes, I did.
What was that?
So after completing cardiology fellowship, I decided that I wanted to sub-specialize further in a field of advanced heart disease that focuses on heart failure and heart transplantation.
Are you board certified?
Yes, I am board certified in both cardiovascular diseases and in advanced heart failure and transplant medicine.
Transplant cardiology?
That's correct.
What is transplant cardiology as a field?
So thankfully, most people are not going to need a heart transplant, but on occasion, patients' hearts will worsen over time and get to the point where they're tremendously weak and can't function on their own anymore. The medicine isn't working. And so the field of transplant cardiology is one in which we try to see if we can find a suitable match for that individual to get them a heart transplant, essentially to restore their life.
Are you trained in basic and advanced cardiac life support?
Yes, I am. And I renew that training every 2 years as part of my job.
Let's talk a bit about your employment background. After you finished your fellowship, where did you go to work?
Right. So after completing the heart failure and transplant fellowship, I took my first position at the University of Chicago as a cardiovascular specialist in heart failure.
And were you employed there until May of 2013?
That is correct.
And where did you go to work after that?
So since May of 2013, I have been at Northwestern University, as I mentioned earlier, as one of the heart failure and transplant cardiologists.
Do you hold any leadership positions at Northwestern?
Yes, I do.
What's that?
So one of them is I am the medical director of the Mechanical Circulatory Support Program.
Mechanical Circulatory Support Program.
Right.
What is that?
Yeah, I'll keep it brief. But basically, we talked about heart transplant for a minute. So patients whose hearts become very weak, perhaps they're not a good suitable match for a transplant, or they just don't have time to wait for a transplant. We can implant mechanical heart pumps that, combined with their weakened heart, can restore blood flow to their body to improve their quality of life and allow them to live longer.
Do you have any other relevant leadership positions at Northwestern?
Yes, I do. I'm also the program director of the Advanced Heart Failure and Transplant Fellowship Training Program.
And what does your job at Northwestern entail as relates to heart disease treatment prevention?
Sure. So I could answer that by basically putting it into three major domains. As a cardiologist, I perform a lot of clinical work. That is probably the most intensive part of my job.
Before you go on, would you tell the jury what's meant by clinical work as compared to what?
Absolutely. Clinical work basically means patient care. Okay, so it's the actual act of taking care of patients, whether it be in the hospital, outside the hospital. That's what we
That's very
I also do
Not this,
a fair amount of
some other
education
video
and teaching. I teach the students, residents, and fellows. I travel across the country and deliver lectures on a variety of cardiovascular topics and help chair medical meetings. And another part of my job as a cardiologist is I conduct clinical research and have been doing so in a variety of cardiovascular diseases for nearly 20 years.
Do you spend most of your time with patients?
Yes, that is for sure the most exciting.
And what does your clinical practice then entail in terms of patient care?
Sure. So my clinical practice has three components. Number one is these patients can sometimes have pretty complex medical conditions. And then interlining of heart for diagnostic purposes.
Given that you deal with a number of patients who could be really, do you ever have patients that will pass away?
So I work with a tremendous team, and my colleagues save countless lives, but unfortunately, many patients do die.
Do you ever have any involvement in determining the cause of death?
Oh, yes, I do.
Could you explain?
Sure. One of the most important, in fact, is to determine what's wrong with the patient, including if they do actually die, how did they die? And so there are a number of ways in which I participate in that role of figuring out what happened to a patient, how did they die?
Are you involved in any hospital committees as their purpose is determining the cause of why people die or pass away?
Sure, I do. So outside of being in the trenches, taking care of the patient at the bedside and figuring out what's going on and trying to discern what might have happened, I also participate on a committee that meets regularly. And what we do is we review
all the cases in the cardiac intensive care unit. We look at any near deaths and deaths, and we review looking at the medical chart and all the evidence to try to figure out what might have happened for quality purposes, to figure out if there was something else we could have done, and also to improve just our overall knowledge of the field.
You have experience with patients who sometimes pass away during what's called clinical trials.
Yes, so I also participate in clinical trials where we try to determine if a certain medication or a certain device is worthy of being approved to help patients. In the course of clinical trials, sometimes there are deaths. And so in my role, I have sat on committees, and our purpose on that committee is to review any deaths that do occur, look at all the evidence to figure out, number one, why did the death happen? And number two, and sometimes this is one of the more important parts, to distinguish, was it a cardiac cause or was it for a reason that is not related to the heart?
We're bringing this further home to this case. Do you have experience with cardiac patients who die from what we call low oxygen?
Oh, most certainly I do.
Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, so because I am a cardiologist who takes care of patients in the intensive care unit, having low oxygen levels is not uncommon. A lot of different disease processes can cause it, and low oxygen levels can be very detrimental. Some of our patients require ventilators, respirators, and so in the course of caring for these patients, sometimes they succumb to their illness because their body is not able to get enough oxygen.
Do you ever have to determine cause of death in the heart transplant context?
Yes. So in the field of heart transplantation, what happens is when you get a phone call that somebody has died and they want to be an organ donor. So what I need to do is look at the case from afar, but try to look at all the records as closely as possible to really sort out how that individual died, and if there's any issues related to their heart or other parts of their body, to make absolutely sure that that heart would be a good match for my patient who we're trying to help. And so that's another element where you have to be really meticulous as you go through. You don't want to miss anything here, right? I mean, the stakes are way too high.
We've heard from a couple of pathologists in the trial. Does your job require you to work with pathologists?
Oh, yes, it does.
In what way?
So I work with cardiac pathologists actually pretty closely, perhaps more so than other general cardiologists. I mentioned that I take biopsy specimens of the inner lining of the heart, and I send those specimens to the pathologist to review under the microscope. We participate in conferences that include reviewing autopsies. One of the things that I have learned over the years, and I've been actually taught this by the cardiac pathologist, is that while a pathologist can look under the microscope and give us very important information, I work with a world-renowned cardiac pathologist who reminds me nearly every day, please tell me as much clinical information as you can. Put it in clinical context, because how I diagnose and interpret what I see under the microscope is very much influenced by the clinical story. And so we work very closely together because my pathologist looks under the microscope and actually sees the tissue at that level, and I can provide all the clinical information, the timelines, etc., so we can truly get it right.
Just a little bit more background, Dr. Rich. Have you published in the field of cardiology?
Yes, I have.
Can you generally characterize what kinds of publications and how many?
Sure. So to date, I've published more than 200 combined abstracts, original manuscripts, reviews, and book chapters. And the topics have been pretty wide-ranging in the field of cardiology, from coronary artery disease, hypertension, which is high blood pressure, congestive heart failure, and another disease actually called pulmonary hypertension.
And what is pulmonary hypertension?
Pulmonary hypertension is high pressures that are specific to the blood vessels in the lungs. Right? So when the blood flows from the heart to the lungs, if the pressure is high in those blood vessels, we refer to that as pulmonary hypertension.
Doctor, would you generally describe for the jurors what is cardiology as a science?
Sure. So cardiology is the study of the heart at the most basic level. It's the study of how the heart functions, what happens when the heart develops disease, pretty much everything heart related and how it interacts with the rest of the body in order to sustain life.
How do you go about assessing a patient with a cardiology issue?
Sure. So when you assess any patient with or without a cardiology issue, but in this context, a cardiology issue, you typically begin by meeting the individual in the office, taking a history, doing a detailed physical examination, reviewing all the medical records and the charts, looking at past procedures and tests that they may have had, and sometimes speaking to other colleagues who you are caring for that patient with together, and then sometimes ordering your own tests for evaluation and diagnostic purposes.
Are some of your patients referred then from other cardiologists?
Yes, so because of my heart disease, close friends who are I'm seeing in the office as new patients have been referred to me by other cardiologists, typically in the community or in the region, and I will assist them in consultation to figure out what's going on and what we need to do to help that individual.
In the ICU, do you take care of patients who have problems beyond the heart?
Yes, so it's interesting. As a cardiologist, I think part of the important reasons why they require of us to do that internal medicine residency training is because no organs work in isolation. And so my patients who have heart disease who also require the intensive care unit, they will usually have issues with many other organs, their lungs, their kidneys, sometimes the brain, the liver. And so you really have to be adept and have a really good understanding of not just the heart, but all the organs of the body and really how they interact.
Dr. Rich, let's talk about your role in this litigation. How did you come to be involved in this case?
I was contacted by the state of Minnesota, and I was asked as a cardiologist if I could review the facts of this case to help determine how Mr. George Floyd died.
Have you been compensated by the state for the bulk of the work you've done on this case?
No, up until my time here now at trial, I have not received compensation.
And why not?
Probably for a couple of reasons. Mostly, I felt that my job as a cardiologist could really help inform the facts of this case. Every year, I take on a number of professional activities without compensation. I actually think it's a duty of our field. And so in this case, I felt I can make a meaningful contribution to the medical field.
So for your the compensation for your time while you're here at trial, are you being compensated at $1,200 per day?
Yeah, it's $1,200 a day while I'm missing work back at home.
So let's talk about then your opinion or opinions in this case. Before we do, could you tell us what work you did? What did you review before forming opinions in the case?
Sure. So I was provided with a lot of evidence to look through, but mostly I looked through the medical records, interviews, all the videos that were provided to me, and the autopsy report.
Did you review some journal articles as well?
Yeah, as I was formulating my opinion and creating my expert report, I also looked up journal articles and embedded them into my report for references.
Have you formed any opinions in this case to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to the cause of Mr. Floyd's death?
Yes, I have.
Could you tell us your opinion or opinion?
Sure. In this case, Mr. George Floyd died from cardiopulmonary arrest. It was caused by low oxygen levels, and those low oxygen levels were induced by the prone restraint and positional asphyxiation that he was subjected to.
Let's discuss your opinion, Dr. Rich, and let's start with just a general discussion of the circulatory system in the heart. I'd like to talk about the right side of the heart, left side of the heart, and also the alveoli. Would you start off and just tell the jury, just remind them, what are the alveoli?
Sure. So you might remember hearing about this, but the alveoli are those grape-like structures that are at the very bottoms of the lungs. The alveoli is where the actual gas exchange occurs, meaning that is where, when we take a breath in, oxygen gets across the lungs and into the bloodstream, and then the carbon dioxide that needs to leave the body crosses that same barrier into those alveoli. When we take our deep breath out, that's how the carbon dioxide is removed. So it's the alveoli of the lungs that serve that purpose.
And again, what does the heart do in the body?
What does the heart do? Well, the heart is the major pump, of course, of the body. The best way to think of the heart, in my view, is to actually think of it as two pumps, sort of a right side and a left side. So if we start with the right side of the heart, after all that blood got pumped to the body, it is coming back to the heart. Blood is always returned to the right side of the heart. So this is now blood that presumably does not have much oxygen in it, and it needs to get more oxygen. So that right side of the heart, its job is singular. It is to pump blood to the lungs, to those alveoli. So the blood, when it heads towards the lungs, it can pick up that oxygen that it doesn't have right now, and it can deliver carbon dioxide and other acids and waste products to be expelled from the body. Once that blood from the right side of the heart has picked up the oxygen that it needed, it sends it to the left side of the heart. Now, the left side of the heart gets all the glory because it is what then pumps all of that oxygen and nutrient-rich blood to the entire body, meaning to the lungs, to the kidneys, to the brain, to our muscles, to deliver oxygen, because every organ, every tissue of the body needs oxygen in order to function. And then once that process occurs, it repeats back to the right side and so forth.
And what happens if the lungs can't deliver sufficient oxygen to the heart? That is, if they're in a low oxygen situation.
Okay, well, the heart is only as good as the fuel that it's provided with. So when that right side of the heart sends blood to the lungs and says, okay, can I have some oxygen, please? If there is no oxygen there, or not enough oxygen there, there is nothing the heart can do to extract more from the lungs. So it has to take that deoxygenated blood, that blood that does not have enough oxygen, and pump it to the left side of the body. The left side of the body says, okay, this is what I have. This is what I'm going to pump now. And so what ends up happening is that the lungs don't give enough oxygen to the body. The heart then has to pump insufficiently oxygenated blood to the tissues of the body. And that's when problems occur.
Well, then returning to your opinion, cardiopulmonary arrest caused by low oxygen induced by positional asphyxia. What caused the low level of oxygen in the case of Mr. George Floyd?
Well, in his case, it was truly the prone restraint and positional restraints that led to his asphyxiation. In a nutshell, he was just simply unable, using all of his muscles of respiration, his chest wall, what we call accessory muscles of respiration, which are extra muscles that will be triggered in the event that you're having trouble breathing. He was trying to get in enough oxygen, and because he was unable to, because of the position that he was subjected to, as we just discussed, the heart thus didn't have enough oxygen either, which then means the entire body is deprived of oxygen.
So, low oxygen induced by positional asphyxia. Did you consider other possible causes of Mr. Floyd's death?
Sure. I tried, of course, to be as thorough as possible, but I focused mostly on two other potential causes. Number one is whether there could have been a primary heart contribution to George Floyd's death. And the second was whether a drug overdose could have caused the death.
So, doctor, would you tell the jury what is a primary heart event?
Sure. So a lot of things can injure the heart. For example, if you do not take in enough oxygen, that will injure all the organs, including the heart. When I use the term a primary heart event, I mean something that originated from the heart itself. So, for example, a heart attack. Right? One of the arteries of the heart just suddenly got blocked completely, and a heart attack occurred. Or the heart just, without any explanation, nothing else secondary inducing it, went into a serious ventricular arrhythmia. Okay, so the bottom part of the heart, that part that we were talking about that needs to pump blood to the body, suddenly went into a chaotic all on its own. If any of those things happen, then I would consider that a primary heart issue, not being caused or secondary to something else.
So you considered whether or not Mr. Floyd might have passed away from a primary heart event or a drug overdose. Did you reach an opinion or come to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to whether either of those two causes explain Mr. Floyd's death?
Yes, I did.
Would you tell us your opinion?
Sure. After reviewing all of the facts and evidence of the case, I can state with a high degree of medical certainty that George Floyd did not die from a primary cardiac event, and he did not die from a drug overdose.
Thank you, Dr. Rich. Would you tell us what evidence or fact documents, what did you look at to help reach that conclusion of primary heart event and or drug overdose?
Sure. The three aspects of the evidence that I spent time reviewing were Mr. George Floyd's medical records, the videos, the different angles from the day that he died on May 25th, 2020, and the autopsy report.
Medical records, the videos, and then the autopsy report. Let's start with the medical records then of those three. Would you tell the jury what you were looking for in the medical records?
Sure. So you get the medical records, usually pretty thick, but you take it one page at a time. And at the outset, I was looking to see if he had been diagnosed with any medical, sort of the first step, in kind of what you do with a patient in the office, sort of what medical problems do you have? So I was looking to see initially what diagnoses George Floyd may have previously been diagnosed with.
And what were your takeaways then from having looked at the medical records and done the assessment?
So at that level, I felt pretty confident that Mr. Floyd had three medical problems. Number one, he had hypertension, high blood pressure. Number two, it appeared to me that he had suffered from anxiety. And three, it looked like he also struggled with substance abuse.
Other than those three conditions, did Mr. Floyd have any diagnosis of heart disease while he was still alive?
No, he did not.
So you said you looked at the medical records not only for diagnoses of pre-existing conditions, but also for evidence of medical encounters?
Correct.
And by that you mean hospital visits, clinics, etc.?
Emergency room visits, exactly.
What did you find in that regard?
So this is, in my opinion, was a really important part of the review as well, because every time Mr. Floyd had an encounter with a medical professional, I viewed that as an opportunity to see if there was any signs, symptoms whatsoever, even subtle, that could have indicated, for example, that he had been going on with his heart. And so at the emergency room visits, he had one prolonged hospitalization. I really tried to take a look at everything. Any opportunity I could to see if he ever complained of chest pain, which he did not. Palpitations, which is a fluttering sensation of the heart. I reviewed all the documented physical examination of his heart to see if there were any abnormalities noted, and there were not. No murmurs, nothing found. I looked at all of his labs that get sent to see if there were any cardiac markers of injury, which he did not. I reviewed his EKGs and his other tests. I tried to be as thorough as possible because I view what we do as a clinician in some ways as actually being a bit of a detective. And our job is to try to figure out what might be going on, even if it's not overtly stated so in the chart.
Would you tell the jury, by the way, what an EKG is?
Sure, of course. So an EKG is a shorthand for an electrocardiogram. That's the test where you'll see people put these little sticky things on the chest. We call them electrodes. Basically is an opportunity at the surface level of the chest, but the technology is so fascinating. It can give you a glimpse into the heart itself to see a whole host of things, including, is there any evidence of any heart injury happening now or previously? Any normal heart rhythms? A whole host of other information that we can get from the EKG at that snapshot in time. And then sometimes what we'll do is we'll repeat EKGs down the line so we can compare and contrast and see if anything has changed.
So you looked at all of this medical information on Mr. Floyd and EKG. Did you note any cardiac problems that related to Mr. Floyd?
I noted no cardiac problems in medical records as far as Mr. Floyd's medical condition is concerned, including everything I mentioned, the EKG, even a time where they put him on a continuous cardiac telemetry monitor, which they'll do sometimes just to see beat to beat if anything's going on. I reviewed that as well.
Did you see any evidence of Mr. Floyd having had any abnormal heart rhythm?
His EKG showed absolutely no abnormal heart rhythms. That cardiac I mentioned that he had on for a few days did have on a rare occasion something you would call a PVC, which is a very normal finding. I don't know if anyone's ever felt their carotid flutter for a second or something like that. It happens to all of us. But absolutely no ventricular arrhythmias for the duration of the time that he was on the monitor.
And PVC is not a kind of plastic pipe. You mean preventricular contraction.
Yeah, premature ventricular contraction. Sometimes people refer to it as a skipped beat. A really normal phenomenon. If you drink a little coffee, anything else, you're sleep deprived. It's for us to have those fully normal findings. Something none of you should be if you feel that.
Find any evidence that Mr. Floyd had any negative heart condition?
There was absolutely no evidence to suggest that at all.
Dr. Rich, isn't an abnormal heart condition?
So thank you for that question, because I think that's an area of confusion sometimes. So high blood pressure in and of itself is not a heart condition. High blood pressure occurs for basically two reasons. Number one, high blood pressure originates in the blood vessels of our body. Oftentimes it's genetically determined why our blood pressure might start to go up over time. If you have a strong heart, you can also generate high pressures, and so those two in combination. So why? Well, so I'll pause there and can explain more.
Well, did Mr. Floyd have a strong heart?
So every indicator is that Mr. Floyd had actually an exceptionally strong heart because he was able to generate pressures of upwards of 200 millimeters on some occasions. We talked a little earlier about my role as a heart transplant cardiologist. One of the problems with patients when they need a heart transplant is the exact opposite. Their hearts are so weak they can't generate a high blood pressure. Their top number just beat. The reason why high blood pressure though is important, and it is important to treat high blood pressure, is because over time, if high blood pressure goes untreated, 10, 20, 30 years, the impact of that high pressure heart can eventually start to become a bit of a problem. So the way I explain it to my patients who come into the office and I talk to them about treating their high pressure is I say, remember, the heart is a muscle. If you go to the gym and you pick up a couple of dumbbells and you start to lift the weights, initially it feels fine. In fact, you probably get a little stronger. Your your muscle will likely get even a little bigger, which is exactly what it's supposed to do. And initially, that might actually be a really good thing. What if I came back, 10 years later and said, how's it going? You'd say, man, this is getting pretty tough. And then the muscle can start to tire out. So we do want to treat high blood pressure. I can't emphasize that enough. High blood pressure should be treated, but high blood pressure in and of itself is not a heart condition.
So we talked about your review of the medical records. You told us that you also looked at video footage in forming your opinion, which is what you're looking for in a video footage that you looked at.
Sure. So my approach to the video initially was sort of similar to my approach with the medical records, meaning I wanted to just do some cursory inspection, observation, basic stuff. What did Mr. Floyd look like? Was Mr. Floyd talking? And if he was talking clearly, coherently, answering questions appropriately? Did I notice any evidence of abnormal physical exams on the video? Actually, I was trying to look for as well. When Mr. Floyd was walking, did it appear like he was walking without difficulty, or was it looking like he was perhaps with low blood pressure and maybe going to fall down? I was listening for any opportunity I could hear. He might say, I'm having chest pain, or I'm having those palpitations or fluttering sensation. Basically doing what I do when I assess any person for a possible medical problem. I was looking for any and all of those possible subtle signs.
So this is video footage on May 25th of last year.
May 25th, that's correct.
We focused on things that would give you any insights into his ability to breathe.
Yes, of course.
And the ability to expand what's referred to as his chest wall.
Yes.
Again, to refresh the recollection of the jury, what is the chest wall?
Yeah, so the chest wall, which I'm trying to sort of show you with my hands here, basically makes up the bones and the muscles of the entire rib cage. And it might have been explained previously to you, but the chest wall and the muscles and how they interact, along with the diaphragm muscle inside, are the key structures that determine if someone is able to take in enough air and able to get enough up. So if there is, for example, the lungs can be working okay, but if the chest wall is diseased, if the muscles associated with the chest wall aren't able to contract and move and do the job, enough oxygen can't get in that way.
So doctor, in our COVID world, do you make clinical assessments of your patients in your work by video?
Yes, actually, that is one of the transformations that we have needed to adapt to this past year. We are getting back to now seeing most of our patients in person, but during the course of this pandemic, to minimize exposures, we've set up a lot of these video visits with patients. And what I came to appreciate is that while there's no substitute to actually putting your hands on a patient, that's still preferable in my opinion to really examine them closely. You can get a lot of information off of a video assessment, even physical examination, by looking at, I have them turn their neck to the side and I can see their neck veins, which is an indicator of pressures. I can see their legs to look if there's any indication of swelling, which might be congestive heart failure. Of course, I could just see the patient. I can see how they're breathing. I can hear how they're talking, if they seem breathless or short of breath. So we actually have found out that we can do a lot via video assessments.
Were you able to then see Mr. Floyd at the period of time after he was first approached by the police on May 25th, 2020?
Yes.
What were your observations about Mr. Floyd from that initial encounter with police?
So from his initial encounter, remembering particularly when he was asked to get out of his car, he appeared fearful, but was speaking, I thought clearly, answering questions appropriately. Didn't see any acute, what we would call acute distress. I saw no indicators at that time that he was suffering from low oxygen, for example, or from any active medical problem. And as I said, I was really trying to keep a close eye on some of the subtleties of his appearance and speech.
Were you able to observe at the point that he's been asked to get into the squad car?
Yes, I was.
What were your observations with respect to that
Yeah, so I watched him walk to the squad car, and then I was observing an interaction where they were asking him to go into the back seat of the car. And heard him talking about how he was claustrophobic. Um, there were times where he was being, I'm not sure if it was pushed into the car or how it was. And even made indicators at that time that he couldn't breathe. But all of my observations at that point were still that up until the point that he was kind of getting pushed or pulled through the car and ultimately onto the pavement, up until that point, I also saw no evidence that there was anything active going on from a cardiac standpoint. And that was really important for me to conclude.
And what sort of active thing might you have been looking for related to the heart over that period of time?
So, for example, let's say that he was having arrhythmia, an abnormal heart rhythm, especially if it was originating from the heart. Oftentimes, what will happen is you'll have the heart rhythm that goes abnormal. You will go from being like totally fine, like we all are here today, to instantly dizzy or even passing out. I didn't see any indicators that was happening. I didn't hear him complaining of dizziness or, again, fluttering of the chest. I didn't see any swelling in his spine. And I didn't want to take anything for granted that even from the initial encounter up until that point, what if something developed from point A to point B? And so again, up until that point, I saw no indicators of low blood pressure or anything else abnormal with it.
Then turning then to the restraint on the ground that you were referring to, what were your observations then as a cardiologist from your having viewed Mr. Floyd's restraint on the ground, Mr. Chauvin?
Sure. So my observations were that he was restrained in a life-threatening manner. Specifically, my observations was that he was on the ground in the prone position, handcuffed, hands behind the back, a knee on the back of his neck, a knee on the back of his upper torso or shoulder, hands pushing his handcuffed hands further up into his chest. I observed a knee compressing his buttocks or upper thighs, and then at various points, his lower limbs, his lower extremities being pinned down to the ground. So that my initial observation was, what is the position, first and foremost, that he is being subjected to?
And did you see at some point in watching the video that Mr. Floyd went into cardiopulmonary arrest?
Eventually, yes, I did.
Do you know what Mr. Floyd's heart rhythm was when he was taken from the scene?
Well, so in the course of the restraint, I was looking to see if his deterioration occurred rapidly, like I was just talking about. For example, a primary cardiac event, the most common arrhythmia is what we call ventricular fibrillation, or VF for short, VFib. When that happens, the individual will look relatively okay, meaning they're alert, they're talking, and then they will immediately become unconscious. On the other hand, if the cause of the cardiopulmonary arrest was from something else, for example, low oxygen levels, you will typically see that deterioration happening much more gradually and slowly. So my observations were the second, that you can see, at least I see, his speech starting to become less forceful, his muscle movements becoming weaker, until, of course, eventually his speech became absent. Eventually, his muscle movements were absent. And then it was later discovered by the heart rhythm. He was in a PEA, cardiopulmonary arrest.
So I'd like to talk with you about two concepts. The one being PEA, which is pulseless electrical activity, and the other one being a thing called a fifth delay. So first, Dr. Rich, would you tell us what pulseless electrical activity is?
Sure. So pulseless electrical activity, or for short PEA, is a chaotic heart rhythm that you can see on the EKG or on the cardiac monitor, but there is an absence of a pulse. And so it doesn't meet criteria for this asystole that I think we'll talk about in a minute, or for ventricular fibrillation. Ventricular fibrillation, I'll just use my fingers, is basically the heart rhythm looking like this. Okay, it's a little subtle fluttering, but basically nothing else going on. Pulseless electrical activity, if you are a clinician, a doctor, or a nurse, or anyone for that matter, who's ever been trained in cardiac arrest, one of the things that will come to mind immediately is whenever you see a PEA arrest, you need to think about what's causing it. Because nearly all PEA arrests are being caused by something relatively specific. And if you can identify what that is, you can be reversed.
And what is the most common cause of PEA?
So you might have heard of others talking about the H's and the T's. So one of those H's, the most common cause for a PEA, cardiopulmonary arrest, is hypoxia. Not enough oxygen level, low oxygen.
And what about asystole?
So asystole is the flat line. So, when any human dies, they will eventually go into asystole, where there will be absolutely no heart rhythm occurring, even this chaotic rhythm. But that is, again, sometimes called the flat line. So BFib is this kind of thing. PEA can have a variety of chaotic looking rhythms without a pulse, and asystole is the absolute absence of any cardiac electrical activity.
If Mr. Floyd is in a PEA state, or generally anyone, is PEA reversible?
So it is important to put it into context. So we see PEA cardiac arrests in the hospital all the time. Whenever you see a PEA cardiac arrest, you rush to it, of course, in the protocol. And that protocol is the H's and the T's. And so you give oxygen if you don't think they have enough oxygen. That's the most critical thing to do. Depending on the other H's, for example, hypovolemia or hemorrhage. If you think they're bleeding out from a trauma, you rush and give blood. We're doing these things, of course, simultaneously because time is of the essence. So we resuscitate patients with cardiopulmonary arrest from PEA not infrequently. Unfortunately, PEA can also be a devastating cardiac arrest, and despite all of our best abilities, sometimes it's not.
Dr. Rich, did you see any evidence at all that George Floyd had had a heart attack?
No, none whatsoever.
What about this notion of something called a silent heart attack?
Silent heart attack. Well, so silent heart attack, a silent heart attack is sometimes referred, it looks like someone might have had a heart attack, but there were no clinical signs to suggest it. It's a relatively uncommon finding. It tends to happen in patients who have diabetes, because when you have diabetes, one of the problems with diabetes is you lose some sensation in the nerve ending. And so typically when you're having a heart attack, you'll see people clutch their chest. Oh my God, I'm having chest pressure, chest pain. Sometimes diabetics, well, that it's possible that they can have a silent heart attack. But there was no evidence that Mr. Floyd had any type of heart attack, a silent heart attack or a non-silent heart attack.
you talk about this a little bit, about the notion of cardiac arrhythmia, the flood rate of the heart. I think you referred to either the VS or the VT, ventricular fibrillation, or ventricular tachycardia. Was there any evidence that he had either one of them?
No, there are no
When somebody is suffering from ventricular tachycardia, did you describe that as what we might refer to as a sudden death event?
Yes, so ventricular fibrillation can certainly cause sudden cardiac death. That absolutely could be described as that.
And again, in viewing Mr. Floyd and his encounter on the videos of May 25th, did Mr. Floyd die a sudden death?
Mr. Floyd died a gradual death. It would not be considered a classic sudden death from the standpoint of how you're putting into that context, meaning when people have that ventricular fibrillation, that VF arrest, they will literally go from being fine one moment to completely out the next. You know, I don't know what happened. I was sitting next to him and he keeled over and ran around. And then that could have been a VF arrest. So sometimes there's semantics in terms of this, but in the case of Mr. Floyd, yes, he did have a cardiopulmonary arrest, but no, he did not. There was no evidence of a sudden cardiac death from defib or any other malignant heart arrhythmia.
Okay, so we talked medical records, we talked about your review of the video. The third thing you said you reviewed was the autopsy report and findings. What were you looking for with respect to the autopsy report and findings?
Sure. So we're talking about the autopsy report here towards the end. I actually looked at the autopsy report first. Then I went back to the medical records that we've already talked about, and then I went back to the autopsy again. So what I was looking for in the autopsy was, well, first of all, everything. When we get an autopsy, oftentimes you'll get it because you're looking, could there be something that we weren't aware of that could have happened? But in addition to looking at all the findings, my major focus, of course, as a cardiologist, was anything and everything related to the heart.
What did you find?
You know, it's interesting. I think what was most important was not only what I found, but what I did not find. So what I found was that his heart architecturally looked normal. He had a description of coronary artery disease, which I found notable because, as I mentioned before, he had carried a diagnosis of coronary artery disease. Now, I mentioned that I found it notable. I certainly didn't find it notable because, unfortunately, coronary artery disease is so common. I mean, statistically, not to scare anybody, many of us in this room likely have coronary artery disease. I looked at whether there was any evidence whatsoever that Mr. Floyd could have had a heart attack based on autopsy. So when I looked at those arteries around the heart, I not only looked to see how narrow they were and what the composition of that narrowing was, but also whether there were any platelets or clotting factors or anything else of that nature in the arteries, which is what would be there if there was a heart attack.
And then did you see evidence of the platelets you would expect if Mr. Floyd had had a heart attack?
No, there was no description of any of the platelets or clotting factors or anything that would block off an artery. None of the arteries were totally, the word we're often uses occluded, totally blocked off, which is what happens in a heart attack.
Yeah, I want to ask you about some of your specific findings in this regard. But first, for the jury, would you just tell them whether you excluded coronary artery disease as a cause for Mr. Floyd's death?
Yes. I have excluded that with a high degree of medical certainty.
Now, you talked about looking for evidence of platelets from the autopsy report that you would expect if you had seen those
saw was I looked at the heart muscle. So not only did the heart muscle itself not show any evidence of any injury at all, you would see it. What if you mentioned the silent heart attack? What about a few years ago, somehow you had a full heart attack? You would see evidence of that on the, you would see, yes, scar tissue, etc. So not only did I not see any evidence of that, the pathologist did a very good job, in my opinion, actually, of describing what's called the endocardium. The endocardium is the innermost lining of the heart, and that is the most susceptible part of the heart to cardiac injury. Even the smallest of heart attacks will always originate on that endocardium, the inner lining. And the endocardium was not only described as normal, it was described as smooth and glistening, a completely normal finding, no evidence at all of even small microscopic injury.
Were you able, by your looking at the autopsy report on the heart, was any evidence as to whether Mr. Floyd had ever had a heart attack, even going back into the past?
And no evidence whatsoever of a previous heart attack.
Doctor, what is ischemia?
So ischemia is a reduction in blood flow to any organ of the body, that can be the heart, the kidney, that can lead to basically insufficient delivery of oxygen for a short period of time. And if ischemia continues to occur for long enough, that can sometimes cause some irritability in that organ. But it's important to distinguish ischemia from infarct. Infarct is actually what we mean when we say a heart attack. When a marathon runner, their muscles will get temporarily ischemic. When we lift muscles in the gym, when we talk about feeling the burn, that means you are tickling ischemia. Lactic acid buildup, and that's what's
Any evidence of ischemia?
not anymore.
Let's talk about the blood vessels, the arteries, and the plaque in the heart. Were you able then to eliminate the occlusion, the blockage in the arteries as a contributing cause of this disorder?
Yes, I'd like to clarify. I saw no occlusions, meaning I saw no complete blockages. There were narrowings. There were narrowings in more than the blood vessels. Importantly, the main coronary artery, called the left main coronary artery, there was no description of any narrowing or disease in the left main coronary artery. Well, because that is the very first pathway that blood travels down to then branch off into multiple other arteries. And so left main disease, we sometimes call it in cardiology, is among all of the vessels, probably the highest risk blood vessel if it were to get blocked off.
So how would you characterize the nature of the plaque within the artery? Was it soft? Was it fractured? How would you characterize it?
I would characterize it the way that the medical examiner characterized it. I'm not an expert at characterizing plaque at a microscopic detail, but what I did appreciate was the description of what seemed to be not only relatively conventional looking artery narrowings, plaque buildup that we all will eventually get in our arteries, but also in one of the arteries, it was described that there was an element of calcium. And I only mention that because that also indicates that this coronary artery disease didn't just kind of develop right away. It was probably a slow residual buildup of this. That actually is a very clinically relevant finding in the field of cardiology.
Good speech, my brother.
Doctor, did you make any assessments around the size of Mr. Floyd's heart?
Yes, I did.
Would you tell the jury about that?
Sure. So when looking at the size of his heart, not just the size, but of the thickness of the heart, it was described as being mildly thick or mildly enlarged. Now, depending on which criteria you use, one criteria would agree with that it was mildly thick or enlarged. Others would suggest that it was in the normal range. I do believe that it was likely mildly thick and mildly enlarged. It is an expected finding in somebody that has high blood pressure. So even though there are some scoring systems that might say it wasn't even enlarged at all, in my view as a cardiologist, I do believe there was just the smallest element of increased heart thickness. And as I mentioned before, that's important because that's exactly what the heart is supposed to do when there's high blood pressure. That is a normal response. The muscle is getting stronger, it's allowing the heart to work and work well. Now, if that goes on for, like I said before, 20 years, you can have problems. But early on, having a mildly thickened heart is not only a normal finding in someone with high blood pressure, it may actually be beneficial in the short term.
Did you see any evidence at all that the primary cause of Mr. Floyd's death originated in his heart?
No, I did not.
Let's talk about the subject. Whether or not Mr. Floyd suffered from a drug overdose and died from a drug overdose. That was something that you also considered as a cause.
Yes, sir.
Were you or are you familiar with Mr. Floyd's toxicology results?
Yes, I am.
What or which substances did you consider in evaluating Mr. Floyd's toxicology history?
When I looked at the toxicology reports, I focused mostly on the finding of fentanyl as well as the finding of methamphetamine.
What role, if any, do you feel that the fentanyl played in the cause of Mr. Floyd's death?
As far as I can tell from reviewing all of the facts of the case, I see no evidence at all to suggest that a fentanyl overdose caused Mr. Floyd's death.
As a cardiologist, do you occasionally have to care for patients who struggle with opioids or opioid addiction?
Absolutely.
So here you found that the fentanyl, in your opinion, played no role in Mr. Floyd's death. Would you tell us why it is you hold that opinion? How do you reach that conclusion?
Well, I think I would break it down to just two major reasons. Number one, it appeared to me that Mr. Floyd, who was an acknowledged frequent chronic user of substances, particularly opiates, likely developed a high degree of tolerance. There's even one emergency room visit that I had reviewed where he came in and he told the emergency room team that, he was tearful and he says, I'm having trouble with substance abuse. So I just took, I think he said I took 8 Percocets within 2 hours. He had no side effects from that at all. They observed him for a couple hours and they discharged him. And just so looking through it, looked like he had built up a high tolerance just in general to opiates. But the second, and just as important, maybe more important, I didn't see any of the signs of an opiate overdose when I reviewed the.
And when you then are referring to the signs of an opiate overdose, would you tell the jurors or describe to them what are those signs and what didn't you see?
Sure. So in my experience in the intensive care unit, taking care of patients who come in with an opiate overdose, first of all, they are usually extremely lethargic, oftentimes nearly unarousable. And then you try to wake them up and they're falling right back asleep. They're not talking to you. If they are talking to you, they're often having slurred speech. If they're standing up, which they wouldn't be if they had fentanyl intoxication and overdose, they would have to imagine get pretty dizzy pretty quickly. I kind of saw all the opposite with Mr. Floyd. I saw that he was alert. He was awake. He was conversant. He was walking. And yet, according to the toxicology report, he had this degree of fentanyl in his system. So just looking at the clinical story, I didn't see any signs or symptoms of fentanyl overdose.
Let's turn to methamphetamine. What role do you feel that methamphetamine played?
I feel it played no substantive role at all.
And why is that?
Well, all considering it was very relatively low level of methamphetamine in the system. And so when you look at the context of the case and you see a relatively low level of methamphetamine in the context of everything else, I felt very confident that that low degree of methamphetamine was not what was triggering this profound cardiopulmonary arrest and ultimately PEA arrest.
So, Dr. Rich, then, taking into account all of the evidence that you reviewed, do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to whether Mr. Floyd's death was preventable?
Yes, I do.
Would you tell us what that opinion is?
Yes, I believe that Mr. George Floyd's death was absolutely preventable.
Were there critical points in time during his subdual and restraint on the ground when you feel measures could have or should have been taken that would have preserved his life?
Yes, I do. I think there were several junctures, actually.
Would you tell us about those?
Sure. Well, the first, of course, was to not subject him to that initial prone restraint positioning that he was subjected to. I mean, that is first and foremost. So if that was not the case, I don't think he would have that. The second, though, was when he was in that subdual and restraint positioning, and he was stating repeatedly that he can't breathe, and he was getting a little weaker in his speech. There was one moment in the video where I heard one of the officers saying, I think he's passing out. That would have been an opportunity to quickly relieve him from that position of not getting enough oxygen, perhaps turn him into a recovery position and allow him to start to expand his lungs again and bring in oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide. So in addition to not putting him in that position in the first place, when there were signs that he was worsening, repositioning him, I think very likely would have also saved his life.
Was there a point in time, Dr. Rich, when Mr. Floyd was checked for a pulse when he was in the subdual and the restraint of Mr. Chauvin?
Yes, there was.
At the time that he was checked for a pulse and he no longer had one, in your opinion as a cardiologist, was there anything Mr. Chauvin could have done at that point in time that would likely have saved Mr. Floyd's life? Well, at the time that Mr. Floyd is determined to have not had a pulse, what is your opinion, the reasonable degree of medical certainty as to what Mr. Chauvin may have done that would have potentially saved his life?
Overall, well, just prior to that point, I heard one of the officers actually ask, actually on two occasions, if Mr. Floyd should be turned on to his side. And the response was, no, just leave him. And once the officer announced that he did not have a pulse anymore, he actually said he does not have one, was the exact words. At that point, the immediate response would then be to not only relieve him of the restraint, but at that point, now you've got to start CPR. You've got to start immediate chest compressions, because we know that if you can get to a patient right away, even when they've lost their pulse, even when they've gone into a cardiopulmonary arrest, there is a significant opportunity to save a life. But for every minute that transpires, that you are not performing the basic life support and CPR measures, the literature would suggest an approximately 10 to 15% less chance of survival. It is why we pour so many resources these days into community education and training for bystander CPR, because it's so effective and it works if the person can be tended to quickly enough.
Then from your review of the video, where you could see Mr. Floyd and Mr. Chauvin there on the ground, if Mr. Chauvin knew CPR, did you see any reason from your observation that he could not have supplied CPR?
Not within the opinion, medical opinion, so that it's considered.
I'm sorry, man.
This is my new page. I'm live in my other page.
So at the time then that Mr. Floyd was actually put into the ambulance from the scene, in your opinion as a cardiologist, what would have been the prospects of resuscitating him at that point?
Or you may give an opinion if you have one.
So at that point, I think the chance of meaningful survival, unfortunately, was very low, because I counted the number of minutes that he was on the ground, pulseless, without any CPR. And by the time the paramedics rushed in to get him, and to get him onto the stretcher into the back of the ambulance, at that point, a lot of time had passed. I give tremendous credit to the efforts of the paramedics and the doctors and nurses in the emergency room. I mean, they worked on him for what seemed this day, and this is now.
Dr. do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to whether Mr. Floyd would have lived if not for the 9 minutes and 29 seconds of the dueling restraint?
Overruled if you have an opinion.
Let me finish my question for you, Dr. Rich. Do you have an opinion as to whether George Floyd would have lived if not for Mr. Chauvin's dual and restraint of him for 9 minutes and 29 seconds on the ground?
Yeah. Overruled. Reasonable degree of medical certainty.
Yes, I believe he would have lived.
Last question, Dr. Rich. Do you have an opinion as to whether a completely healthy George Floyd, that is, any healthy human being, would have survived this dual and restraint that Mr. Floyd suffered during the 9 minutes and 29 seconds on May 25th of 2020?
It's sustained is irrelevant. The general person.
I'm sorry, I didn't. My question to you, Dr. Rich, is would any person, a healthy person, have survived the circumstances and conditions that George Floyd underwent during the 9 minutes and 29 seconds on May 25th of last year?
Sustained.
No further questions, Dr. Rich.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll take our 20-minute mid-morning recess. Let's come back at 11:25. Thank you. As you can hear there, they are taking a quick 20-minute break. And of course, we will bring you back some of the coverage here on NewsNOW from Fox, including Minneapolis. We'll go back to them in just a little bit, everybody, but we want to have a really big opportunity here. You can see in my background, we got a different set right here in Phoenix, Arizona, debuting the new headquarters right here. I got this new set. Take a look at here. You can see a little of the newsroom now. You can see Christy right there as well in the mix, and we're going to see a lot more of the DJs, producers, all in the mix right here from the new worldwide headquarters in Phoenix. We are liking that move already, so that is some great stuff, and we look forward to all the opportunities that will come from this set and the future of NewsNOW as it continues to expand even more. All right, everybody, let's go back out right now to Minneapolis, where they continue their coverage in this Derek Chauvin trial case.
And so his opinion and his credentials are extremely important in adding that to the mix of already having heard from a lung breathing specialist as well as the medical examiner.
I know that there was some concern by the defense that this testimony would be redundant, but as you pointed out, his expertise is different. He focuses on the heart. Do you think that that is what the prosecution was really trying to get across? Is like, here's another expert, another, part of our anatomy that can weigh in on how George Floyd died.
I think the state is working really hard to try to foreclose any argument that the defense has that it was George Floyd's heart that caused his death or a drug overdose. And this was really the last piece that they could put on. In other words, a doctor who's an expert in cardiology, the workings of the heart. We hadn't heard from such an expert before. So this is just the state trying to close all of the potential doors that the defense is trying to open to show that George Floyd's heart and the drugs were actually the cause of his death.
I know there's been some discussion. The defense is expected to be calling up witnesses soon. Do you think that there's a chance that Derek Chauvin could actually take the stand?
Well, there's certainly a chance, and it is Mr. Chauvin's call whether he wants to take the stand. The conversation that you have as a defense lawyer with the client is about whether the client can add something. This is a little different case than what we typically see, which is a police officer who shot somebody, and that police officer testifies that he or she made a split-second decision, and they were often emotional and remorseful. But this case isn't about a split-second decision, and so the defense does not need Chauvin's testimony to talk about that, what he was thinking. In fact, if he testifies, he opens himself up to cross-examination by the state about just what he was thinking when the other officer said he doesn't have a pulse, should we roll him over, and that sort of thing. The other reason clients sometimes testify is that the case is not very good, but they can humanize themselves. What we've seen of Chauvin is that devastating, again, picture of him with his knee on George Floyd's neck. He hasn't been emotional in court when people have been showing video and when witnesses who've been very powerful have testified. And so I don't know how he would come across on the stand. If he's going to come across the same way, I don't think it would be helpful to do that.
Very interesting. And there was also a moment towards the end of Dr. Rich's testimony. He stated that repositioning George Floyd likely would have saved his life. When he lost his pulse, it should have been an opportunity to save a life. And then prosecutor Gary Blackwell had a line of questioning, and oftentimes we heard the defense object. What was that was playing out?
It was hard to hear, but the defense was objecting that this opinion was outside the area of expertise with this particular witness. He could certainly testify about the heart, what he thought caused George Floyd's death, but the defense was arguing, speculating on whether he could have been saved or not was kind of outside the scope. Although he was able to say he counted the minutes from when CPR could have been given. And so many minutes went by that by the time the EMTs got him in that ambulance and started trying to resuscitate him, it was too late.
And you mentioned speculation. I know there were a lot of hypotheticals thrown around in the courtroom last week, and I kind of want to take us back to last week, because during this morning's motion, the judge made mention that he was surprised that the prosecution did not object when the defense asked the DCA agent on the stand what he heard on that police body cam, what he heard George Floyd saying in the moments before his death. Were you surprised to hear that by the judge?
I was. I think it was also the judge giving a reason why he was excluding the state's attempt to get an expert to talk about how hard it is to identify what you're hearing on an audio tape. And also, the agent Ryerson was asked that kind of suddenly out of the blue by the defense. He hadn't been asked to review it before. And so the state was talking this morning about putting on an expert who would talk about the suggestibility. In other words, if I haven't heard a tape before and somebody suggests to me what I'm supposed to hear on the tape, then it's more likely that I would hear it. And the judge excluded that or kept out that evidence. And I think as a kind of dig to the state, he was saying, you know, I can't believe you didn't object to that because I sustained the objection. It really wasn't an appropriate question, but you didn't object. So there's it.
In the past, or in the course of 2 weeks, we've ended some breaks with the prosecution wrapping up its line of questioning. And in some instances, the defense will come out and cross-examine. In some instances, Eric Nelson does not. What do you anticipate as we leave this break?
More hypotheticals, probably. You know, this is an expert witness on the heart, and the heart obviously is a key component that causes death or not in this case. And so he has to be able to establish either with this witness some information that his experts can count upon and try to use, or try to somehow damage this witness's credibility. I think that's going to be very difficult, but I expect to hear more hypotheticals about what could have happened, what might have happened. And we've seen in the past that all witnesses, not just experts, end up saying yes, 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 because the hypotheticals involve not necessarily situations with facts related to this case. That's why you saw some frustration on the part of Blackwell last week when he referred to John Wilkes Booth as his Lincoln, other than the play, or you know, your husband, how was the play? So I think there's a question of whether the hypotheticals are relevant to the issues in this case. But I expect to hear many more hypotheticals in the cross-examination of Dr.
All right, Mary, thank you as always. Appreciate your expertise. Looking forward to hearing from you a little bit later in our broadcast. Again, right now the court is in a break, about 10 minutes into a 20-minute break, and of course we'll pick back up when proceedings resume. In the meantime, we want to check in with Fox 9's Paul Bloom, who is live at the Media Center, located just across the street from the Hennepin County Government Center where the court hearing is taking place. And Paul, what's the latest?
Well, some great insight from Mary Morty, former Hennepin County Chief Public Defender, with us for this broadcast. So from my perspective down here at the courthouse, I got here early, obviously, the aftermath of Sunday's event in Brooklyn Center. We were wondering what type of impact they may have on this trial. Of course, a police shooting, the death of another Black community member at the hands of law enforcement, the use of force incident playing out on Sunday, the subsequent unrest. So early this morning, when we got down here, I did do a quick walk around the Hennepin County Government Center. Of course, it is already heavily fortified for this case, but based on the overnight violence, civil unrest, I thought perhaps maybe we'd see an even increased level of security. I did not. It seemed like they kind of kept status quo around here with National Guard, troops on point, law enforcement around the courthouse. We've heard of no issues outside the courthouse. I was also curious to see how exactly it might impact proceedings in the courtroom. Would this judge, Peter Cahill, address it with this jury? And as we found out, Defense Attorney Eric Nelson very much wanted this matter to be addressed by the jury. In fact, he's been calling for an emergency sequestration, basically putting the jury in the hotel for the rest of this trial and sort of cutting them off from the outside world because of the influence of what happened. Eric Nelson told Judge Cahill he is very, very much concerned that because of the unrest, the violence that unfolded yesterday all over the news media, these jurors are at home. They're told to stay away from news of this specific case, Derek Chauvin's trial. But obviously, word could have spread about what was going on last night. There's even a juror we learned today from the Brooklyn Center itself where the shooting of Dante Wright occurred. So anyway, early this morning, during a motions hearing, Judge Eric Nelson asked Judge Cahill to think about sequestering this jury. I want to play that portion of today's courtroom proceeding.
I understand that it does not involve these same parties. But the problem is that the emotional response that case creates sets the stage for a jury to say, I'm not going to vote not guilty because I'm concerned about the outcome. During voir dire, we have many jurors who on both sides of the political or social debate who expressed concern about if they don't agree, if the public doesn't agree with the verdict. This incident last night highlights and I think brings it to the forefront of the jury's mindset that a verdict in this case is going to have consequences. And they've been exposed to that already.
And the prosecution vehemently objected to this proposal from Eric Nelson that again sequester the jury altogether, or at the very least, what they call voir dire the jury, so go down the panel and ask them if they had seen the news, if they had been influenced, do very delicate so as to not impact their case. But Steve Schlischer, the prosecutor, saying this is a different matter. Brooklyn Center, different community, different police force. World events are going to continue to unfold outside of this courtroom. So then it was up to Judge Peter Cahill to make the final ruling.
I'm going to deny the motion to question the jury for additional voir dire. This is a totally different case. And I realize it's civil unrest, and maybe some of the jurors did hear about that. The reason why, in my initial order, I said we're not going to sequester, but we might go to it in the middle of trial if the concern there was that despite keeping jurors anonymous, that somebody may find out who one of the jurors is and reach out and have an inappropriate attempt to tamper with the jury. There's no indication that that's happened in this case, and that was the concern about going to sequestration. I understand the argument from the defense that this now puts them in even more ill ease, but I think sequestering them would only aggravate that. Oh, I heard about the civil unrest, and now the judge is putting us into sequestration. There must be a greater threat to our security. I think the better way is to just continue the trial as they go going, but as a separate issue, they should treat it as such. It'd be a different story if it was civil unrest following another verdict. So the jury can see what the consequence of a certain verdict might be in a similar case, but that's not the case. The jurors all are aware and were concerned about it because of what happened in May of 2020. The civil unrest that followed there. Not a big surprise that there's civil unrest in response to this case. I don't think that should heighten the jurors' concern. I think it's probably the same as it was before. They all have a concern that they expressed and were very honest about. And so I'm not going to sequester them. I'll sequester them on Monday when we anticipate
You sound good.
So as you heard there, a very reasoned approach from Judge Obvious. He saw this type of motion coming. He will not sequester the jury. One other point to note right at the end there, if you caught it, he did say closing arguments next Monday, April 19th. It was appearing that we would be heading in that direction, but the judge putting it on the record to expect closing arguments next Monday. And then at that point, the jury would have it back at 10 minutes to sequester where they do not go home until reaching a final verdict. And Beasley, before I just wrap it up, just a couple other things to think about this afternoon. We've got Rich. He'll be cross-examined here coming up out of the break. And then two more witnesses. One is the spark of life evidence or testimony that we've been waiting for. A brother, we understand, of George Floyd to take the stand, talk to human loss, the emotion of losing George Floyd on Memorial Day of last year. So we expect to get back to some emotion in the courtroom. And then finally, there was some motions, arguments over the testimony of the state, what we believe will be the final witness, University of South Carolina professor. The defense said we've already had enough experts, enough news reports, analysis. We've heard from at least half a dozen people already down. It's enough testimony. The judge was respectful of the argument and said, yeah, we have had enough, but there are some areas where this witness can testify specifically at state police standards. So a couple more things to come here today from the Henderson County Courthouse, but by all indications at this point, it would appear perhaps by the end of the day, the state will have to extend.
All right, Paul, thank you. Let's turn now to Fox 9's Hannah Flood, who is live in the newsroom with more on this morning's testimony. Hannah.
Hey, good morning, DC. Yeah, we've really been watching Dr. Jonathan Rich's testimony this morning. Gary Moriarty pointed this out earlier about that more and more of these experts and about this not being cumulative. At the beginning of this, Judge Cahill later have a situation where you call up 5 people who basically say the same thing. What they were talking about this morning was more related to what Paul was talking about. This is the 4th expert we're expecting to hear from later. But I think it kind of crosses over into this testimony as well. This expert, Dr. Rich, is an expert in cardiology, so that's kind of his focus, his area of expertise. We haven't heard from that before. The doctor who was talking about the breathing doctor is more focused on lungs, and now this doctor is more focused on the heart. We know from Dr. Baker, the medical examiner's testimony on Friday, that the heart played a really big role in this, and that ultimately it was common complications with Floyd's heart that led to that lack of oxygen that then led to his death. So Jonathan Rich got up on the stand this morning, and like we see with of these experts, he went over his credentials, who he is, what he practices, where his expertise is, and then we go into his ruling. And his ruling was that George Floyd died from cardiopulmonary arrest due to low oxygen. And we have a clip of him that we want to play for you.
In this case, Mr. George Floyd died from cardiopulmonary arrest. He was on like low oxygen levels, and those low oxygen levels were induced by the total strength and physical station he was subjected to.
What caused a low level of oxygen in the case of Mr. George Floyd?
In this case, it was through the total strength and positional restraint to his asphyxiation. In a nutshell, he was just unable, using all of his muscles of respiration, his chest wall, what we call accessory muscles of respiration, which are extra muscles that be triggered in the event that you're having trouble breathing. He was
This is one other thing.
oxygen, and because he was unable to, because of the position that he was subjected
I'm live right now.
as we just discussed, the heart thus didn't have
Covering George Floyd
and they
case.
used the entire body.
So you consider whether or not Mr. Floyd might have passed
Check
away
it out.
of primary heart event for a drug overdose. Did you reach an opinion or conclusion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to whether either of these two causes Mr. Floyd's death?
Yes, I did. After reviewing all the facts and evidence, this was taken with a high degree of medical certainty that George Floyd did not die from a primary cardiac event, and he did not die from
Yeah, a couple big areas of focus coming up next time. Of course, that last part that you heard there of Dr. Rich saying that an overdose on its own, and that was kind of a big piece of that the state needs to get on the record, because we know that the defense is arguing the opposite, and their life has been an expert the opposite. The state needs to get something. Statement on the record. Another thing that I want to point out, and we've heard Dr. Rich talk about the prone position several times. We've heard about that a lot with both use of force experts and some of the medical experts that were on the stand last week. The prone position refers to Floyd being on his chest, laying on the ground on his chest. So you heard there that the medical examiner. So if we looked at things like the videos of this incident, looked at the autopsy reports, we looked at medical records, including EKGs that were performed on George Floyd in the past, and talked about his heart. What was the health of his heart? And basically said that he did have high blood pressure, he did have some heart things going on, but that would not have been his cause of death. And then Dr. Rich said, I think repositioning would have also saved his life, which again plays into the state's argument that they have to make, or evidence that they have to get on the record that it was the position and the pressure specifically on his neck that led to his death. Then Dr. Rich kind of went into a little bit more detail, not only about the heart issue, but about the drug issue. And he said he listed off two of the main reasons why he doesn't think that Floyd's death was an opioid overdose. And one that he talked about was because of tolerance. He said tolerance being an opioid user, and he referred to something in his medical record where he had gone to seek medical help after taking a certain amount of opioids. And going into that, as we know that he had a tolerance in his body. But then he also said he just did not choose.
All right, Doctor. Thank you for being here with us today. Just a few questions for you. Just to confirm you're not a pathologist, correct? The vast majority of the patients that you treat are in a clinical setting, correct?
Okay.
Correct. Meaning you're alive, generally. Can we agree that it is a pretty common occurrence that people die who have arteries that are 90% blocked?
Okay. Well, everyone dies eventually, but not from the 90% block.
People die every day who have a 90% block.
People die every day from heart attack.
There's a difference between heart attack and heart failure, right?
Heart attack and heart failure in Europe are completely different.
So, people who have a 90% blockage may have a cardiac event and may die.
As a hypothetically, there are undoubtedly people who have died from coronary events with 90% blockages or without blockages.
And people may not experience pain, right, as a result of an arrhythmia.
Correct.
And sometimes people have a 90% blockage of the right coronary artery, a 75% blockage of the left anterior descending artery, and they die, right?
Again, this is a not this case we're talking about.
Exactly.
In a hypothetical case, somebody who has any extent of coronary disease, including the descriptions that you just gave, could potentially die.
And again, they may have no pain associated with fatal arrhythmia.
Fatal arrhythmias often are not associated with pain. But
you would agree that Mr. Floyd did have coronary artery disease?
Absolutely.
How is that normally, in a living person, how is that normally diagnosed?
So usually the patient has symptoms. So they will have chest pain, or they're exercising, right? If you're an active person, you shouldn't have chest pain. And if you come to the doctor and say, something's not right, every time I try to exert myself or I try, boy, it's still the elephant on the chest is a classic description. So that would be of many possible ways that you would diagnose coronary artery disease in someone who is alive.
You also do a stress test
sometimes.
A blocked right coronary artery that can contribute to a fatal arrhythmia.
Anyone can have a fatal arrhythmia or without coronary artery disease.
And so if a vessel is blocked and blood is not getting through that vessel, what happens?
Well, it depends, but I'd like to answer that for you. So in the case of Mr. Floyd, what has most likely happened, based on our understanding of coronary physiology, is precisely because he had a narrowing of up to 90%, and it had calcium in it. We know that that developed gradually, and the heart is fascinating in what it does. It develops what's called coronary collaterals, which means the body makes additional blood vessels so that if there's one artery that's narrow, it recruits and builds many more blood vessels to supply blood to the heart. It's actually why you are more likely to die from a heart attack if you less narrowed artery and the plaque ruptured and blocked the vessel than if you started with a more severe narrowing. because of all these unbelievable coronary collaterals and adaptive responses that the heart does when that happens.
What is a sick dose of methamphetamine?
Prescribed?
Illicit.
I never consider any illicit drug to be off the street that's not prescribed by a physician to be safe.
And methamphetamine is a vasoconstrictor, correct?
It often can act as a vasoconstrictor.
That means it constricts the blood vessels more, correct?
Yeah, correct. That's what vasoconstriction means. Narrows them down more.
You understand based on medical records that there's prior evidence of methamphetamine use by Mr. Floyd?
Yes, sir.
And methamphetamine can cause some changes to the heart in and of itself, correct?
Correct.
In fact, it sort of ages the heart more, right?
I've never used that terminology.
Okay. What does it do to the heart over prolonged use?
Every case is different, and it depends what we mean by prolonged use. So 1 day, 1 week, 25 years. Like most things, if you use something you smoke cigarettes for 50 years, you're going to have more problems than if you smoke a cigarette or a pack every once in a while.
In terms of what does methamphetamine do to the heart itself?
Methamphetamine, if used over a long period of time, can sometimes contribute to the development of coronary artery disease, as we've been discussing. It can constrict blood vessels, as you mentioned. It can have kind of a host of different effects on various parts of the body, including the heart.
And there's lots of things that can make the heart work harder and faster, right?
Sure.
I mean, methamphetamine being one of them.
Yes.
Vigorous activity being one of them. Sure. Adrenaline.
Yeah, I mean, we all right now have a lot of adrenaline flowing through our system. Adrenaline is needed for life, for sure.
Increases in adrenaline can cause the heart to work harder and faster.
Yeah, I mean, so adrenaline, which is the lay term for catecholamines, that's the purpose of adrenaline, is to get us more blood. When we go and exercise, the purpose of adrenaline is so we can run and we can jump, and we ask the heart to allow it to grow.
And have you in your practice worked with someone who has a paraganglioma?
I have had a couple of patients who've had what we call pheochromocytomas, which is a type of paraganglioma. Yes.
In the hip area generally?
No, generally it's actually near the adrenal gland, which is sort of just near the kidneys. But these paragangliomas can sometimes pop up at different places.
And how are they typically identified?
Well, so it depends. If it was clinically pertinent, that's how I diagnosed the ones that I've had. The classic findings are the person who's saying, I'm always having headaches. What is with these headaches? I'm always sweating. Why am I always sweating? You start to say, I wonder if something is releasing a hormone that can be contributing to that. Other times, like in my opinion, the case here with Mr. Floyd, you'll pick them up incidentally. Let's say
they're also often identified because a person contributes to high blood pressure.
they can. That is right.
You have agreed that you've reviewed the medical records of Mr. Floyd, correct?
Correct.
And he has a pretty significant history of extremely elevated blood pressure. Right?
Yes.
I think the one you referenced, that the top number was over 200.
Yeah. On more than one occasion.
More than one occasion. And the lower number of the blood pressure was likewise elevated. Right?
Yes.
Did you observe evidence that in the medical records that Mr. Floyd was taking prescribed medications to control his blood pressure?
I saw in the records during an emergency room visit that was prescribed high blood pressure medication. What I could not see is whether he was taking them or not, but it did look like at one point there was a prescription given to him. I think one of them was for amlodipine, which is a calcium channel blocker, and one of them was for I think either hydrochlorothiazide or chlorthalidone.
So you'd agree that the records that you had for Mr. Floyd were relatively limited, agree? I mean, they weren't his entire life medical.
I don't know when he started to see medical professionals. So for all I know, the first instance in the records that I saw was the first time he started to see medical professionals. I'm not sure.
So how many years of past medical records did you review?
I believe 3 or so. I think beginning of 2018 is when I think they started.
Are paragangliomas ever removed from the person?
Paragangliomas, if they are causing those symptoms I mentioned, the pulsatile headaches, the sweating, etc., a surgeon would sometimes remove them.
Would you prescribe an amphetamine for somebody who has a 90% blockage of the right coronary artery and a 75% blockage of the left anterior descending artery?
So first of all, I don't typically prescribe amphetamines. I have many patients who have coronary artery disease that are on stimulants, okay, for a variety of medical conditions. So I just don't prescribe them, but I do have many patients with coronary disease stimulants.
Would you recommend to someone that they use methamphetamines with that degree of coronary artery disease?
I would never recommend that anybody take methamphetamine off the street for any reason.
You aware of the reason that deaths where both methamphetamine and fentanyl are found occurs at a much higher incidence?
Repeat that question, sure.
Are you aware that research has demonstrated that those who use methamphetamine and fentanyl have been notably higher than meth or fentanyl alone? A combination.
Facts.
There's just assuming facts that is overruled, assuming is it the scope of their foundation? So the state did ask him for toxicology opinion.
It was a reference to HAC, this is the traffic jam.
Or, I mean,
I'm not familiar with the breadth of the literature looking at all of the different combinations of drugs and which combination worsens or improves survival.
You testified that Mr. Floyd, based on your review of the video, did start complaining of shortness of breath prior to being placed in the prone position.
Yes, I heard on more than one occasion he say the words, "I can't breathe."
And if Mr. Floyd had simply gotten in the backseat of the squad car, do you think that he would have survived?
You may give if you have a medical opinion as to that.
So, had he not been restrained in the way in which he was, I think he would have survived that day. I think he would have gone home or wherever he was going to go had he not been subjected to the positional restraint that he was.
So in other words, if he had gotten in the squad car, he'd be alive.
I think my answer remains the same. Anything other than that scenario that he was subjected to, I have no reason to think from a medical perspective that he would have survived that day, correct?
And in terms of the prone position, you would agree that the prone position is not in and of itself inherently dangerous.
In an ordinary individual, if we were to take away everything else that was going on, and someone was just simply lying in the prone position, while there are many patients who that would be inherently dangerous, the average individual, I would agree with you, probably just lying flat in that situation generally would be dangerous.
Even in the ICU, there are circumstances where people have serious medical conditions where they're maintained in a prone position.
In the ICU, when patients are put into the prone position, it is when it is a desperate attempt to save someone's life where their lungs have actually developed what we call acute respiratory distress syndrome, or ARDS. They have a ventilator in to make sure that the amount of air that they get, no matter their positioning, will always be enough. And so it's a funny thing about the prone positioning in the ICU on a respirator, but because of respiratory physiology, sometimes that will actually help open up certain segments of the lungs that are needed. But it's really important to keep in mind that they are on a respirator every single time to open up those lung airways, and they're usually on sedation as well to keep them comfortable.
And my last question, doctor, is after someone's heart stops, is it possible that they continue to respire?
It is, well, I'm not sure I could answer that with certainty other than to say there are these things that are called agonal breaths. So when I'm in the intensive care unit with a patient who is dying and they go into cardiac arrest, once in a while you will see them take one or two extra breaths. I'm not sure the exact mechanism or the physiologic trigger for that. So you could potentially see some extra breaths for a short period of time.
By a short period of time, up to a minute?
In my experience, if the heart has completely stopped, I would not expect to see the breathing continue for up to a minute, but I might expect it to be seen for several seconds.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Anyone there?
Dr. Rich, you were asked several questions that had to do, or at least had as a premise, the blockage of Mr. Floyd's artery. Is blockage a proper medical term to you as a cardiologist to describe the narrowing in Mr. Floyd's artery?
So when we try to use a terminology that is not medical terminology, right, to explain these phenomena, the term blockage, I tend to use when the blood vessel is completely blocked. There's a blockage. I will usually describe, if I have a patient like Mr. Floyd, who has coronary artery disease like this, I will usually use the term narrowing because the blood is still getting through. In fact, the blood may be getting through just fine. There is no level of narrowing, in fact. Even a totally blocked artery, this is what's fascinating, that develops over time, the territory of blood that blood vessel was supposed to supply can still be getting enough blood because of those collateral vessels that develop. So I would use the term with Mr. Floyd as narrowing.
You were asked questions again about paraganglioma. And I think you told us that those are usually preceded by headaches of some kind.
Classically correct.
One of the symptoms.
Yes, that is right.
Again, did you hear amongst the various complaints Mr. Floyd may have had about pain, did you hear any of them being a headache?
No, in fact, when I saw that there was a paraganglioma described as an incidental finding in the autopsy report, I actually, when I went to the medical records, I used that Control F button to put in headache and make sure that I never found headache, in addition to scrolling through all the records. I didn't find headaches at any point.
When you referenced paraganglioma being an incidental finding on the autopsy, would you tell the jury what's meant by incidental?
Sure. So all of us have things in our bodies that aren't causing any medical problems. But if they're discovered, let's say someone gets a CAT scan for one reason, they might find that there's a cyst on the kidney or the liver. Sometimes we'll even pick up benign tumors. So we refer to those as incidental findings. In fact, in the case of glioma, the name you would actually call it is an incidental loma, because you don't think it has clinical relevance, but it was found and described in the imaging, or in this case, the autopsy.
Are you familiar with any of the data as to how many people in the United States have ever died as a paraganglioma as the principal or primary reason for that?
To be honest, I don't know the exact numbers. I just know that they are very low.
Now, you were asked questions about high blood pressure, the role and impact of methamphetamine, paraganglioma, narrowing arteries. Can any of those things in of and by themselves cause someone to die without first injuring the heart?
Can you repeat the question?
Yes, what I'm trying to get at, whether we're talking about high blood pressure, methamphetamine, paraganglioma, and the impact on the adrenal, narrowing of the arteries, can any of those things by themselves cause a person to die without first impacting the stoppage of the heart?
Well, the reason I asked you to ask the question again is because I want to make sure that I'm precise and clear here. High blood pressure can cause death in manners outside of the heart. For example, it can contribute to a stroke, which we know Mr. Floyd didn't have. And the other thing that can occasionally happen is this thing called an aortic dissection, where the aorta, the main tube that leads the heart, can tear. That can cause death. I want to make absolutely clear, these conditions can cause death on occasion in areas not involving the heart, but most of the time, if death is going to occur by them, it's going to be caused because of their impact on the heart.
And did Mr. Floyd have an aortic dissection?
No, he absolutely did not, based on the review of the autopsy.
Didn't have a stroke?
He also did not have a stroke.
So again, just to be clear for the jury, with all the discussion about the narrowing of arteries, death, etc., was there any damage at all observed to Mr. Floyd's heart muscle?
Based on my review of all of the evidence, the EKGs, the autopsy report, I found absolutely no evidence at all of heart damage to Mr. Floyd's heart.
Thank you, Dr.
And
On redirect, you were asked a question about coronary heart disease, high blood pressure. If any one of those can cause independently, and you answered relevant to the high blood pressure, right? But you would agree that when you combine a lot of that, you would agree that the body is, a lot of things are happening at the same time, right? Yeah. And in combination, if you have a paraganglioma, you've got an increase in the fight or flight kind of response. You've got coronary heart disease. You've got high blood pressure. All of those things combined could cause, even if there was not a physical restraint.
well, here's his paraganglioma. The likelihood that his paraganglioma was even releasing any hormone is highly unlikely.
The combination, the drugs, the high blood pressure, take the paraganglioma out of it, right? The increase in the drum, a struggle with officers. All of those things combined together, even in the absence of prone restraint, could have resulted in death. Yes or no, sir?
Upon my review of the evidence and facts of the case, I found no evidence to support that.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Thank you, doctor. Thank you. You're excused. Thank you.
And we have our next witnesses at 1:30, is that correct? All right, we have two witnesses for this afternoon, members of the jury, and counsel and I have to finish up the meeting, which we got one, so we're going to break to 1:30. Have a good one. And there you go. There you go. They are on another break right here on NewsNOW from Box, but this is what we do, bringing you the mixes as they are happening here, and they're going on a short lunch break. When they come back, we'll be bringing you all the coverage here as well. Some of the coverage right now, Fox 9 Minneapolis, while they still provide the updates.
Good morning, I'm BCO O'Leary. Thank you for joining us for our live coverage of the Derek Chauvin trial. Today is day 11 of testimony, and the court right now is in a 1-hour lunch break. Dr. Jonathan Rich, a cardiologist, was just there on the stand. He's a cardiologist at Northwestern Memorial Hospital in Chicago, and he kicked off testimony this morning. The doctor's giving the jury some insight on his opinion on how George Floyd died. Mary Moriarty, a former Hennepin County Chief Public Defender, joins us for some legal analysis. And Mary, the defense spending a little more than 20 minutes questioning Dr. Rich during cross-examination. Is there anything really to make of how long someone is on the stand?
Not really. It's how effective either the direct examination or the cross-examination is. As a defense lawyer, you ask yourself, has this particular witness damaged my theory of the case in any way? Are there questions that I can ask to get out information that might help my expert witnesses? Are there questions, leading questions that I could ask that might put a dent in this witness's credibility? So length of time alone really is an indicative of effectiveness.
And I asked you this question earlier. I just want to ask it again for those who just may be joining us online or on Fox 9. What have been your biggest takeaways from Dr. Rich's testimony? This is a cardiologist. I don't believe the court has heard from a heart specialist so far during the duration of the trial yet.
We have not. We've heard from a lung and breathing specialist. We've heard from medical examiners. We've heard from toxicologists who deal with drugs, that kind of thing. So yes, this was a new witness today. We're talking about the heart. This witness, in my opinion, was excellent. He was able to give kind of a clinic on how the heart works and some interesting facts about the heart to the jury. He also did a really effective job of talking about why George Floyd did not die of a drug overdose or a heart attack. And even during cross-examination, the defense was trying to ask him some hypothetical questions, and Dr. Rich would say, in this case, this is my opinion. So he was very effective on cross-examination as well. Overall, I think this was a really good witness for the state and really helped kind of close their medical, the fact that their opinion is that George Floyd died because of the restraint put on him by Chauvin and the other former officers.
Another portion that I thought was poignant was when Dr. Rich told the jury that repositioning George Floyd likely would have saved his life when he lost his pulse. It should have been an opportunity right there to save someone's life. So what did you make of that?
It was very poignant. And when you look back on the Minneapolis Police Department policies, they are supposed to be constantly reassessing the situation. They have an obligation to render aid. And so we had a couple of opportunities, or there were a couple of opportunities pointed out by Dr. Rich. First of all, one of the officers, and I think it was Elaine, his side, and Chauvin said, no, leave him where he is. And then the awareness that he had lost his pulse. And the minutes that went by that reduced George Floyd's chance of living by 10 to 15% for every minute. And so it was very poignant, it was very heartbreaking, sad, because according to Dr. Rich, by the time the EMTs got him into the ambulance, there was very little chance for them to resuscitate him.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, Mary, last week's testimony, even today, most part, it's all kind of been devoid of any sort of emotion. But after this break, that's going to change. I'm hearing that we're expected to hear from some members of George Floyd's family.
Yes, that is testimony that is referred to in Minnesota as spark of life. It's actually a concept fairly unique to Minnesota. I think maybe a couple of states have it. Usually witnesses testify. They have to be a fact witness, they have to be an eyewitness, or they have to be an expert. And that's what we've seen so far. These are different witnesses. These are usually family members or friends who talk about who the person was. If you'll recall during opening statements, talked about some information about George Floyd, where he went to high school, what his interests were. We should expect those family members to talk about that. This testimony is usually extremely emotional. Typically, the defense does not cross-examine because these witnesses aren't offering anything related to these issues or that's relevant to the issues that the jury has to decide. Interviewing family members, and so it's very difficult evidence for the jurors here, and very controversial, I should add as well, because it is not similar to victim impact at sentencing because we're not at sentencing. This is a trial about whether the state can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Chauvin's act were a substantial cause of George Floyd's death. So this is actually testimony completely unrelated to that.
And Mary, a motion this morning prior to the trial resuming, one of the biggest developments that we heard is that Maurice Hall, who was a passenger in George Floyd's vehicle evening when George Floyd died, that he is expected to be called to the stand tomorrow. But it sounds like, from what we heard this morning, that it could really get complicated.
What I heard the judge say was that he will put him on the stand outside the presence of the jury. What the defense wants to do is play a good faith of Mr. Hall's statement and generally requires people to be present to give a statement. There are some exceptions. Exceptions have to be if the statement is given under circumstances where the judge finds that the information given in the statement is trustworthy. So obviously the state and defense have different opinions. The state says it's not trustworthy.
All right, welcome everyone here to NewsNOW front box. We are going to break down the coverage, of course, take you back to Minneapolis when the Derek Chauvin trial gets going once again. We are certainly going to keep you in this event. A rebel from a police officer district. But this is a whole other situation. Minnesota once on edge again after a deadly police shooting last night in Brooklyn Center leads to protest and looting. Let's bring you this live update right here.
I will say that one officer discharged their weapon and they struck the driver of the vehicle. And following that, the vehicle traveled several blocks before striking another vehicle. The Brooklyn Center police officers who were present at the scene and who were attempting to apprehend the driver did respond with an attempt at saving the young man's life. However, the young man died at the scene. Our Brooklyn Center officers do wear body cams, and so there's body camera footage of the event. And we do plan on releasing the body camera footage today. In fact, we plan to do so here. But, you know, I want to say that our hearts are aching right now. We are in pain right now. And we recognize that this couldn't have happened worse time. We recognize that sitting at a time when our community, when all of America, indeed all of the world is watching our community, that we are all collectively devastated, and we have been for over a year now by the killing of George Floyd, and that we continue to be distressed as we go through the Derek Chauvin trial. So having a police-involved shooting happen in our community and killing a young man is heartbreaking and just unfathomable. And so our entire community is filled with grief at yesterday's police-involved shooting that led to the killing of Dante Wright, a 20-year-old young African-American man. And I go on to Dante's family and to all those who are impacted by this tragedy in the world over. And while we await additional information from the BCA, which is leading this investigation, we continue
to support members of our community as they gather peacefully amid our call for transparency and accountability. Let me be clear. We will get to the bottom of it. We will do all that is within our power to make sure that justice is done on pay right. We're going to continue to meet with community leaders and to hear voices. In fact, we did that this morning. The chief and city council members and other elected officials from the state, city staff, city manager. We had a meeting with community to be able to hear their voices in this time. And we're also going to have continue to conduct press conferences and share information with the public. As I stated, we do plan to show the body camera footage. We're going to conduct a community press conference following this as well, so that we can talk directly with leaders of our community and organizations and share this information with them as well. We're going to also be providing some crisis counseling and mental health to all of our community members who may need and desire such services. And our collective community is breathing every single life. Every community is important to us. And so events, like yesterday are tragic. And, they take each and every one of us, they take a part of us as we experience these traumatic events. Just being exposed to it, I'm sure you're all feeling the aftermath of the weightiness of what we're all feeling collectively. And so I am going to invite Chief Tim Gannon to come up, and he's going to provide you a briefing about the details of what transpired yesterday, and then we'll look answer questions.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Gannon, Gannon. I'm the Chief of Police here in Brooklyn Center. I've been the chief for approximately 5 years. I've been a police officer since 2010. Today, I will be releasing the body-worn footage worn by the officer involved in the fatal officer involved shooting that happened on Sunday afternoon. I've watched the video myself, and there's nothing I can say to lessen the pain of Mr. Wright's family, friends, loved ones, for that feeling of loss that they must have. That pain is shared by me and also all those involved in the incident. What I can do is convey my deepest sympathies to the Wright family and be transparent with the information I'm aware of at this time. That will include showing a video portion from the point of deadly force used by the officer, as well as the officer's immediate reaction after the use of deadly force. I caution everybody as you watch this, that this will be graphic and unedited. Have that video start, please. It should be on both screens. You turn the lights back on, please. As you can hear, the officer, while struggling with Mr. Wright, shouts taser, taser several times. That is part of the officer's training prior to deploying a taser, which is a less lethal device. That is done to make their partners aware, as well as the subject, that a taser deployment will be imminent. During this encounter, however, the officer drew their handgun instead of their taser. For informational purposes, we train with our handguns on our down side and our taser on our weak side. So if you're right-handed, you carry your firearm on your right side and you carry your taser on the left. This is done purposefully in its training. As I watched the video and listened to the officer's command, it is my belief that the officer had the intention to deploy their taser, but instead shot Mr. Wright with a single bullet. This appears to me, from what I've viewed in the